Murfreesboro and Rutherford County are so rich in their respective histories, with many women who've had integral roles in creating our community's sense of place. The Rutherford Arts Alliance is proud to partner with Murfreesboro City TV to showcase a number of these women as a part of our Leading Ladies of Rutherford County History project. From murals to our community-involved play, A Party of 12 by Mary Donay Johnson, we're proud to honor these diverse women of our past who inspire us as we give them a voice in today's world. Let's find out more about one of these leading ladies.
Amanda Gordon exemplified what life was like during her time. Married to Alfred White Gordon, she worked on a farm and raised a family of 5 children. She was also known for raising prize turkeys. She wasn't a politician or an educator, but Gordon's legacy would be tied to both through her descendants. One of those descendants is former United States Congressman Bart Gordon, and he talks about her life and legacy.
Bart, I'm so glad to get a chance to talk to you about your great-great-grandmother, Amanda Gordon. Yeah. Amanda was selected to really represent the maternal influence on a family such as yours that has had so many public service people, the men particularly in that, and to give a voice to the important role of the agriculture industry here and what women did, you know, in a farming family. And the fact that that family is still farming. Well, they raised the public servants, that's for sure. Yeah. So we want to hear some of your special stories about your great-great-grandmother that we realize was passed down a generation because she was deceased in 1930 before you were born.
Yeah. I was born the same year that her son died in his 80s, and so my remembrance of Amanda really came from my grandfather. And my grandfather, was until his death the sort of historian of the family. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 brothers in his family. He was the oldest. And his mother and father sent him to live with Amanda in her, older years to be able to help there. Mm. And so he was able to know his sort of lifespan and then hear her stories and passed on a lot of those to me. And going back to your earlier point about the women's role, she came along, after the Civil War and where the economy was just a wreck all over Middle Tennessee. Farmers had a little bit better off because they could raise their food and take care of themselves better. But he was very adamant about just how she was the strength of the family as well, and representative of a lot of women at that time. And we still had, when I was growing up, sort of remembrances of her, in that I remember there was a big cast iron pot on the side of the farm or the farmhouse where she would combine lye and ashes and heat it and make soap. Mm-hmm. And then there were, of course, tools down at the farm. And Granddaddy gave me the Bible that's big, these big old-time Bibles that she gave to his mother and inscribed it there. And then he also gave me there were several blankets, and I guess you call these crazy quilt blankets. I don't know what they are.
That's the pattern.
And he would tell me how you could look at the stitches, and as she got older, they would be further apart, and of course she couldn't see as well. And again, being a farm family, you had to do everything on the farm. It would be stuffed with the wool that they would shear from their sheep.
Wow. Well, that's another reason they made it so well during challenging times, because not only did they raise their own food, but they did their own clothes and their own blankets and so forth.
It got cold upstairs where there wasn't a fireplace, so you needed something like this. And he, also told me about some of the traditions that they had that they carried on. Like, all my life, on Thanksgiving Day, there were about 3 families, on the road where we're out there, that would have a hog killing. And it was very, when I say formalized, there was a stratus of jobs. And if you were the senior person, you were the one that would shoot the hog. And then there would be a big vat that they would dip the hogs into the boiling water. And then the next sort of layer were those folks that had the chains that would bring them up and down. And I was always the youngest, so my job, I was a scraper. And so they gave us a knife, and when the hogs came up, we would have to scrape the hair off. And then, of course, after all that, then the more senior ones, would put it on. They would have a wagon, and then they would, cut it up, and then the ladies would have a big meal, for a big Thanksgiving meal that night. And of course, they would cure some of the hams and things like that. But those were, again, some of those traditions that were passed along.
And I think that it's interesting how in our culture in Rutherford County, we're seeing an interest in quilting, particularly be passed on now, and a lot of attention to it.
And the farmer's market right across the way.
Right, the farmer's market, and then the whole interest in early foods in the South. So the culinary arts have their basis in that, where they use once they got the hair off, they used all the skin and everything.
I think they said everything but the squeak or the oink, everything but the oink.
I hadn't heard that one, but that's a good one. So now you mentioned about your father and your grandfather. Now, what was your father's full name?
It was Robert Gordon Jr., Robert Jennings Gordon Jr. My grandfather, obviously, was Robert Gordon Sr. And we're not very imaginative in our family, so that it was Jennings because that was his mother's maiden name. And just like with me, my daughter Peyton is my wife's maiden name. Margaret was my mother's name, so it's Peyton Margaret Gordon. So, and I think that's pretty representative. You'll see a lot of families who would intermingle the different families into their names.
The farm where she lived is still part of the Gordon family. Bart Gordon's cousin Gilbert and his wife Jenny operate a school on the site and use the farm as part of their curriculum. Gilbert Gordon has released a book of his family's history, and from his accounts describe Amanda as a strong-minded woman.
She must have been quite headstrong, energetic, opinionated kind of woman, because at one point Alfred White, during the Civil War, he was taken to, I guess, down here to this courthouse, and by the Union, and they said they wanted him to sign an oath of allegiance to the Union, and he refused to do so. And he said later on, the reason he refused to do so, not that he was so opposed to the Union, but he knew if he did that, he would have to answer to his wife, Amanda. And that was far more deadly than anything the Union would have done to him. So, apparently she was just that kind of a lady. Alfred White also had a habit of cussing a lot, especially when he was out plowing. Our soils are filled with rocks and that kind of plow shank get broken all the time. So, but when he would do the garden, which was close to home, he would ask her to come out and sit in a chair right there beside the garden, because if she was there, he wouldn't cuss as much when he broke things. So she was there to keep his tongue in line while he gardened. So
one other thing that you mentioned about one of your ancestors in terms of the Civil War was the fact that they didn't really join the Confederacy because they believed in slavery.
Right.
What was the reason they did that?
The only battle that any of them ever fought in was at Stones River. And it was strictly because they were here. And it was more of a protection of my home situation. And
the Union soldiers were here.
The soldiers right here, right here in Murfreesboro.
Right.
So of course everybody was up in arms because what's going to happen if they come to my home? And there were even stories told to me from my grandfather about Alfred White at that time, that they had to go out and bury all of their hams and just out wherever they can find a spot in the gardens or in the woods or anywhere, because when the Northerners came, and they were hungry too, those boys were just as hungry, they would find and they would loot all of the food and go into the homes and that kind of thing. We actually found, just in the last few years, someone was out and they found a U.S. belt buckle right 2 feet from our front porch, just inches below. And so they were right there. They may have even camped right there in their yard. So the only reason, they didn't fight in any other excursion anywhere but that one. And because they didn't even believe in secession, you know, they were more Union in some ways than they were Confederate.
So how many generations of your family has lived in that Christiana post office box, Midland community there, on that property around where you two now have the Cedar Hall School?
Well, John Hilton was the first, and he was in the 1830s, I believe, and our children are the 7th generation on that farm.
And the farm was a land grant? Is that correct?
We have learned this recently, that it was actually part of a land grant that was set up for a university for some type of educational purpose, and it never came to fruition. But I think it's kind of neat. There is our little school sitting right in the middle of this. It may have been 640 acres, I'm not sure. But we just discovered that just recently, or at least they're still working on it. Told to us, yeah. So we haven't seen it. We don't know that that's accurate, but.
And what year did you open Cedar?
1991. We just finished our 30th year.
Chronicling stories of family life isn't the only way the Gordons are saving their past. The family also has rare photos of the original house.
At that time, photographers were to go around and they would take photographs of families.
Traveled all around.
Exactly.
They weren't in residence here necessarily.
No. Mr. Shacklet, they didn't come to see Mr. Shacklet, And so, and in this photograph, you'll see Amanda and her husband, and they were dressed well. And then there's this, my great-grandfather, Pettis, who wasn't dressed up. And he had his horse there. And as my grandfather said, he got late to the photograph, and he wasn't going to be in it unless they allowed him to have his horse in it. So you've got this photograph with, everybody there.
The formal and the informal.
Yeah. And the house behind it was the old house, and it was a log cabin, and they wound up selling the cedar logs to one of the pencil companies over in Shelbyville. At that time, Shelbyville was thought of as the pencil center of the world, or capital. And then they used the money from that to build that house. And if you look closely at that photograph, over on the right side of the front porch, there's a little chair, a little children's chair, which I still have. And in the back, the two back chairs or feet where it goes up are shorter, because all the kids would hold on to the chair to learn how to walk.
So did your daughter do this too?
No, she didn't. No. She broke the tradition there.
But it's fun to be able to have the spirit of the family. Sometimes lives in those pieces of furniture, or in quilts like this. And so you lived on the farm until you went away to college?
No. We had a farm. Mama, had milked long enough, and so she really wasn't interested in going out and living on the farm. So Daddy would go out and, on the weekends and in the afternoons and farm. But going back to the sort of the strong women and the influence that women had, one of my, I guess, favorite stories, and really a touching story for me, is that on my 21st birthday, my grandmother, Nora Gordon, came to pick me up at MTSU to go vote. Not vote, to register. And you had to be registered. You had to be 21 at that time.
Okay.
So as we were driving, down Main Street from MTSU to the courthouse, she told me that when she was young, when she was my age at that time, she couldn't vote. Mm-hmm. And told me about the suffrage amendment and how Tennessee was the final state to put it over, and that it passed by one vote. And then she said, well, and your great-grandfather was in the legislature at the time. So everything got quiet. Uh-huh. And I was afraid, Sandy, but I went ahead and I asked her, I said, well, how did he vote? And she said, well, he really wasn't for it, but his mother said he couldn't come home if he didn't vote for it.
Strong women.
Strong women made a difference
Their
for
suggestions.
women all across, and all of us across the country because of that.
Community organizations during this time were primarily male-dominated. Auxiliary groups to those organizations were led by women and were instrumental to how successful each organization would be.
Another area that women got together in groups, besides when they had quilting parties together, were companion groups to, like, the Farm Bureau, the auxiliary, many times it was called.
Well, my grandfather and his father helped. They were one of the, I think, 11 original members of the Farm Bureau here. And also they helped start the Middle Tennessee Electric Co-op. And all of these organizations, they were, you could say, male dominated, but they all had an auxiliary where a lot of the work got done, and that was the women. Mm. And my grandmother Nora, loved those things, and they were very much counted on to be a part of the fabric that helped make all those organizations work and prosper.
And support the whole intentions of the organization, plus give the women a chance to get together and deal with ideas and so forth.
In addition to farming, the Gordon family has also played a pivotal role in the world of medicine in Rutherford County.
Amanda's son, JP, James Pettis, I actually looked this little fact up, was on the original board of the Rutherford Hospital. So in 1927, Amanda's son was serving as one of the first board of trustees, or whatever the official name was. So that was a neat thing, that she raised them then also to be servants of the community. So she must have had some willpower there, and the idea of reaching out to other people, whether in your community or further. I believe he also served, because there's something in Cannonsburg, something with the school system at that time. I don't have those details, but
and
public service. At
that same time, when Rutherford Hospital just started, he was there on the board. But this man, her grandfather, is in the book also as a pediatrician. From
and
Nashville.
He was on the board also, wasn't he?
He was a visiting...
He was just out of med school. So 1927, he would have just finished med school and came up here to serve for a year or two in that Rutherford Hospital, James Kearney overall.
Though she was not world famous, Amanda Gordon's strength, character, and commitment to family were shining examples for generations to come, and truly defined the role of a leading lady.
Well, even though she, died long before I was born, my grandfather, who really is my role model for being involved in public service, passed the torch. When he was young, he lived with her, heard her stories, and then told them to me. So it's that was the string that put us all together, and that's why I think of her more personally than just an abstract photograph on the wall.
And that's so important. So you really got her communicating with you through your grandfather.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
And isn't that wonderful that he was given that opportunity to be with her in those final years and get some of that information imparted to him, then to send it down to you. That's a strength of Southern families.
And grandparents are so important, you know, and people that have not had the chance to spend time with their grandparents and ask them stories, you know, they can't fully understand the camaraderie maybe of the country during World War II, or the hardships of a country during the Depression. So you know, as I tell my daughter, she will never say, "I wish I spent less time with her grandparents." Unfortunately, she didn't get to spend that much time, but I think it was very meaningful for her.
Well, and you passed that on to her because it was meaningful to you.
Yes, exactly.
And that's the nice piece of the family situation. For more information about our project, Leading Ladies of Rutherford County History, visit our website, leadingladiesrutherford.com. Or if you have a story of someone from the past who inspired you, you can share it on our website. For more information about the Rutherford Arts Alliance and what we're doing to promote arts, culture, and heritage, visit rutherfordartsalliance.org. And thank you for watching.